NORML has been the place to go for the latest studies and news on marijuana science, policy, and activism. For over a decade, one man at NORML has written and reviewed more studies and news stories regarding marijuana than most anyone on the planet. First as senior policy analyst and now as deputy director, NORML's Paul Armentano has written for major newspapers, academic journals, and magazines on the subject of cannabis and is frequently requested as an expert witness in the courtroom. His knowledge and experience are an amazing asset to the cannabis community. Available to you now in a segment we call Behind the Headlines with Paul Armentano.
Welcome back, Tokers and Tokettes, and we're getting into a subject that is a very important one that we need to start talking about here in the cannabis community, and that is the concept of toking and driving and the idea of how much is too much and when are you too impaired. All of these things are something that has been studied in depth by our Deputy Director, Paul Armentano, who joined us by telephone from the Bay Area. Paul, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Russ.
The reason I wanted to bring you here is we've been speaking a lot to our friend John Doe with John Doe Radio. He's in Denver, Colorado, and he covers the cannabis community there. And they're all worried about this proposal in Denver, or in Colorado, excuse me, in the State House there, to set a per se 5 nanograms per milliliter of THC in the blood as a per se stoned driving limit. And of course, this leads people to bring up all sorts of things they think they know about drug testing and driving. People saying things like, oh, well, marijuana stays in your system for 3 weeks and all these other things. I thought I'd bring you on here to get down to the science of this. So let's start by explaining what they mean by per se DUID.
Well, a per se statute means that society at large has set a limit, and if a person is over that limit, regardless of the totality of circumstances, by simply being over that limit, they are judged under the law to be in violation of a criminal statute. Now, most people are likely aware of per se statutes because currently the United States has a .08 blood alcohol statute for drunk driving. This is a per se standard, so it says that any driver who operates a vehicle with alcohol in their blood at a level of .08 or higher is considered per se guilty of drunk driving.
Right.
This means that the state does not have to establish through field sobriety testing or other means that the person is actually too impaired to operate a vehicle. The state has already met its burden of proof by simply showing that the person was driving the vehicle and that they had this level of alcohol in their blood. So a per se marijuana statute would take this same principle but apply it to the detectable presence of, in this case, THC in the blood. And it would say that if a person is operating a vehicle and they have THC in their blood at or above this limit, then that person has violated the drug driving statute, and the state does not have to go any further to actually establish that the driver was in fact impaired to drive, because they have violated the statute by simply getting behind the wheel with this amount of THC in their blood.
Yeah, and I think that's something, even with respect to alcohol, that we should always be aware of. Is I think people think of the breathalyzer and DUI statutes with the .08 BAC. They think of that as preventing drunk driving. What they're really doing, though, is just preventing people from having X amount of alcohol in their system, whether they're drunk or not.
Yes, exactly. These laws really aren't about traffic safety per se, including the blood alcohol per se laws. They're about making the prosecution of certain drivers more easy for the state to win these cases. It's quite difficult for the state to establish beyond reasonable doubt to a jury that an individual has gotten behind the wheel and for whatever reason they're too impaired to drive. There's many ways the state goes about prosecuting these cases. We have field sobriety examinations. We have drug recognition experts that take coursework that teaches them how to identify if a person is impaired behind the wheel. There's physiological exams. We measure persons, whether their pupils are dilated. We measure how their pupils follow the officer's finger. We do balance tests, walk and turn tests. We measure their pulse rate. We do blood and urine testing to determine whether certain substances or byproducts of certain substances are present in a person's present in a person's body. We bring the police officer who was at the scene who says, I pulled the person over because they were weaving or they were driving erratically. And they present all of this evidence in court, and the totality of that evidence either establishes to a jury that the person was was impaired beyond a reasonable doubt, or the state fails to meet that burden of proof. But it's a fairly high burden of proof, and as you can see, the state has to take a lot of time and effort to gather all of this information to be able to make its case in court. And what these per se laws, for the most part, are about is really just lowering that burden that the state has to meet. Because once you pass a per se law, as long as you have a blood test that establishes a certain level of a certain compound is present in a motorist's blood above a certain level, the state doesn't have to do anything else, because the statute says that by simply having gotten behind the wheel, whether the person was demonstrably impaired or not, they have broken the law. And we can see with the alcohol laws how inconsistent these can be. It wasn't very long ago that many states said you had to have a blood alcohol content of 0.10 to be per se guilty of drunk driving. But then the federal government lowered the threshold to 0.08. If you look to Europe, several countries have much lower drunk driving thresholds. Many countries in Europe use a 0.05 blood alcohol level as a per se drunk driving. Sweden uses 0.02 as someone who above that level is considered to be per se a drunk driver. So it's not, even when we're talking about alcohol, as if there is a consensus among scientists at what level a person should per se be considered too drunk to drive. And that is the risk that would also be involved in setting a per se statute for marijuana. I can see why some lawmakers would like a one-size-fits-all sort of statute, but right now the science really doesn't indicate that there is such a threshold, nor do I believe there is a need to establish such a threshold. It's right now illegal in every state for a person to operate a motor vehicle impaired by marijuana. And I think the present statutes that are on the books in those states, for the most part, are working just fine.
You know, it seems to me that these per se limit laws, even with respect to alcohol or marijuana, aren't so much about preventing impairment on the roads. It's more like a way of saying we're going to make illegal irresponsible drinking or irresponsible smoking. And the idea being that if you've had 3 or 4 or 5 beers, you shouldn't get behind the wheel. And maybe the idea with marijuana, if you've had 3 or 4 or 5 bong tokes, maybe you shouldn't be behind the wheel. Let's talk about the science behind this, because this is a real concern of many people, especially those of us not in the choir. A lot of the people out there in the mainstream voters have bought into the idea of the alcohol breathalyzer, and they want some sort of similar magic machine when it comes to marijuana. Now, first, we should establish that we're talking about THC in the blood here, because I get a lot of people that comment about the, marijuana can stay in your system for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, but they're talking about urine there. Let's clear that up first.
Sure. There are two, when we're talking about marijuana and drug testing, we're typically talking about 2 primary components. We're either talking about THC or we're talking about carboxy-THC. THC is the psychoactive substance in marijuana. Carboxy-THC is the inactive byproduct. It is what THC is turned into after it is metabolized by the body. Now, THC has a relatively short half-life in blood. THC levels spike almost immediately after inhalation, within minutes. So a person experiences their peak THC blood levels within 10, 12 minutes after smoking marijuana. And then those levels dissipate very quickly, and typically within 3-4 hours, they're really not even present in the blood at all, or if they are, they're at such negligible levels that only the most sensitive testing equipment would detect them. So we're talking about a substance that has a fairly short half-life and that has peak blood levels that are in many ways proportional with the person's euphoric experience. The higher the THC blood levels, the greater association there's going to be with heightened psychoactivity. The lower those levels, the less psychoactivity the person's going to be experiencing. Much like blood alcohol levels, they rise and fall proportional to how intoxicated the person is by alcohol. By contrast, carboxy-THC is an inert metabolite. That means it has no psychoactivity associated with it. Carboxy-THC is typically detected in the urine. It is stored in the fat tissues, which means that it has a much longer half-life. It can be detected in urine in infrequent users for a couple of days. In frequent users, it may be detectable for days or weeks or even months in very heavy users. But when we're talking about many of these per se statutes, like the proposal in Colorado, we're not talking about carboxy-THC. We're talking about THC in blood, and as I noted earlier, for all but the most extremely heavy users, this has typically a very short half-life, and that's why a standard like this 5 nanogram per milliliter proposal for the most part, is a standard that would only identify fairly recent users of the drug. And by recent users, I mean individuals that have consumed the drug within the last few hours.
Okay, so in a state, if Colorado goes forward with this, then basically medical marijuana patients and recreational users will just have to get used to the idea of no driving for 2 hours after use.
Sure, and that's frankly a rule that I think most responsible users ought to follow to begin with. There is psychomotor impairment associated with marijuana. I know there's many consumers within our community that don't like hearing that statement, but if you look at the evidence that has been put forward on this issue, and there's quite a bit of it, we do see that in 3 or 4 different types of performance tests, we do see some impairment associated with the use of marijuana. We see what's known as a standard deviation in lateral positioning associated with recent use of the drug. That's essentially a complex way of saying that the driver weaves. They don't keep the driver's side tire parallel with the median on a closed road test. We see some adverse effects in peripheral vision or tracking. That means the driver is quite focused and aware of what's going on directly in front of them, but they have more difficulty responding to circumstances that may be taking place in the peripheral vision. We also see some adverse response to when they have to respond to things in front of them that require the use of depth perception. We sometimes don't see the sort of time response that we'd like to see under circumstances where the driver is sober. And many of these instances are dose-related, and that's something I'd really like to stress. In low doses, we see very nominal effects on performance, but the higher the doses are, the greater the adverse effects. The other key that I'd like to point out, and a study came out about 4 or 5 months ago that really hit the nail on the head with this, is that we see greater adverse performance associated with more naive users. And we see less adverse of performance on these sort of psychomotor tests when the user is more experienced. It seems that when users are frequent users of marijuana, they do become tolerant to some of these adverse effects. Now, that's not to say, hey, if you're a frequent user of marijuana, you should just go ahead and go out there and drive on the roads. But it is an acknowledgement that there seems to be greater risk of accident when we're talking about more naive users behind the wheel. The final point I'd make, and this has been some data that's been consistent for years now when these tests are done, is that when alcohol is consumed in combination with marijuana, we seem to see an exponentially adverse effect on driving. And what I mean is the driver performs tasks at a level that is far worse than when the driver is using marijuana alone or when they're using alcohol alone. So those are two substances that should never be used in combination prior to driving.
Okay, we're speaking with NORML's Deputy Director, Paul Armentano, an expert on the subject of drug driving, DUID laws and such. I wanted to quickly give folks a kind of an overview of what's going on in the United States. We're talking about Colorado adopting a 5 nanogram per milliliter of THC in the blood per se standard. Above that limit, you would be a stone driver subject to punishment via the law. There is another state with this standard. Pennsylvania has a 5 nanogram per milliliter in the blood standard. Ohio and Nevada are set at 2 nanograms per milliliter, and the states of Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, and I believe Rhode Island have a zero tolerance of THC in the blood. Any THC they find in the blood makes you per se a stone driver. And then with respect to urine testing, we talked about the inactive carboxy-THC metabolite. Illinois, Indiana, Georgia, Utah, Arizona, and Delaware and South Dakota have zero tolerance for those metabolites that show up in P-tests. And in the states of Georgia and Arizona, it's 24 hours mandatory jail time, and in Utah, 48 hours mandatory jail time the minute they detect that. So compared to what some of the other laws are on the books, 5 nanograms per milliliter in blood doesn't sound that bad, Paul.
No, and let me be clear about what this means, because some people are under the false impression that if, say, a state like Colorado passed a statute, and they would then, as you noted, have a statute similar to what's been the law in Pennsylvania now for many years, that somehow inversely implies that if you're driving and you have levels of THC in your blood under 5 nanograms, that somehow is not a criminal offense. That's not the case at all. That simply means that if a person was pulled over and say they test positive at 4 nanograms of THC in their blood, that the state can still bring DUI charges, but that the state is going to have to go about making their case through those more conventional and traditional means I spoke about earlier. The state will have to perform field sobriety testing. They'll have to bring in a DRE. They will probably do a physiological exam, and they will have to make their case that way. So even when these statutes are passed, even when they have thresholds, this does not mean that there's some sort of get-out-of-jail-free card if you're simply under the threshold. As I noted, it's already illegal to drive impaired by marijuana in every state. It's just that some of these states, quite frankly, are tired of losing these cases in court, and they want to make it easier for them to win these cases, and you do that by simply setting this per se threshold. Now, I will note that there is some data available in the scientific literature showing that if we're going to try and estimate a THC blood level for impairment, that 5 nanograms is roughly around the level where we do begin to see some significant elevated risk of accident when drivers try to operate a motor vehicle and their THC blood levels are above that limit. Now, it's an estimate. It's not a perfect limit. It's not necessarily one I would even agree with on some sort of one-size-fits-all sort of statute, but I do want to make people aware that this isn't a number that's just been pulled arbitrarily out of the air, but in fact that there is some scientific consensus indicating that if we're going to go down this road, this is a fairly fair place to start. And I was involved in a limited degree to the discussions that were taking place by this committee in Colorado that proposed this per se limit. And I would like to let a lot of listeners know, particularly the listeners in Colorado, that if it were not for the input of one or two people on this committee that I was in touch with, this committee would have come out of these meetings setting a much lower per se threshold, a threshold around 1 or 2 nanograms, is what was initially being proposed. And as you noted, that's the standard that's in Ohio and Nevada. That is not a scientific-based standard. Those were numbers that were picked arbitrarily by lawmakers simply because at the time the sensitivity of the equipment that is used to test for THC in blood could not go below 2 nanograms per milliliter. That's why that standard was set. Even in those states that claim the standard is 0, technically the standard isn't 0 there because the testing equipment that is used cannot go down to 0. It could only confidently go to 2 nanograms.
Okay. And, with respect to that per se limit also, I mean, it's the same idea we have with alcohol where they say, just because you don't blow a .08 on the breathalyzer doesn't mean that you're not impaired when you're driving. The same logic would apply to a per se standard with cannabis. One last question, and we'll let you go here, Paul. I have a lot of people in the chat room who are medical patients who are bringing up, the other medications, OxyContin, Ambien, all these other things that people get prescribed. Are there any states that have per se limits for prescription medication? Is there a need for such a law or such testing?
This varies from state to state. There are not states that I'm aware of that have per se limits for specific medications, but there are plenty of states that have statutes that say if you are impaired by the use of a prescription medication, you are in violation of the law. And then where this is particularly an issue is with the benzodiazepines, which clearly impair driving performance. We're talking about drugs like Xanax, that are quite popular both by prescription and also sometimes used illicitly by recreational users. They cause serious issues on the road. States are aware of this, and many states will prosecute drivers if they're driving erratically and it's determined that they are using these substances, whether they're prescribed or not. If the use of that substance has impaired your ability to drive and the state can establish that fact in court, in most states that's against the law, whether you're a legal prescription user or not.
All right. Paul Armentano is NORML's deputy director and a recognized expert in all of this stuff about drug testing, cannabis, and driving. He's also the co-author of Marijuana is Safer, So Why Are We Driving People to Drink? And I think we'd both acknowledge that the drinking drivers are probably much more of a danger than the cannabis drivers. Is that true, Paul?
Yes, and I think one of the issues where I think marijuana and driving in many ways gets a bad rap from the general public because the general public is very aware of the way alcohol adversely affects driving, and they're not aware that marijuana can affect driving performance, but it affects it in very different ways. Alcohol tends to make people more reckless drivers, more aggressive drivers. It tends to elevate their use of speed and weaving and making reckless decisions on the road. Marijuana, in contrast, is generally associated with more cautious driving, driving at a slower speed, leaving greater room between your car and the car in front of you. So while they both affect driving performance, alcohol tends to affect driving performance in ways that make the risk of accident much greater than does marijuana. So what we tend to see is that drivers under even low levels of alcohol, including legal levels of alcohol, tend to have a much statistically higher risk of accident than drivers who are found to have even very high levels of THC in their blood. But of course, the safest driver is the driver that does not have levels of alcohol or marijuana in their blood. And the studies really do bear that out.
All right. Paul Armentano, you're a wealth of knowledge. We could talk to you all day, but we're going to let you go. Thanks again for joining us here on Normal Show Live.
Thanks for having me, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
Marijuana and alcohol are the two most popular recreational drugs in America. Marijuana smoking is non-toxic, relatively safe, and has a low risk of dependence. Alcohol drinking is potentially fatal, dangerous to society, and is quite addictive. Marijuana is safer, so why are we driving people to drink? That's the question of the new book, Marijuana is Safer, So Why Are We Driving People to Drink? By Paul Armentano, Mason Tvert, and Steve Fox. Visit Amazon.com or ChelseaGreen.com today to order your copy of